This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 347 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. If you missed it last week, I went over a handful of players that I'm looking to buy this offseason in Dynasty Leagues. Today, the plan is to go over players that I'm looking to sell. Before digging in, though, did you guys see the XFL this past weekend? I actually thought that the gameplay was pretty entertaining. They're even more entertaining when you're playing daily fantasy football. Just head to FanDuel.com, find an XFL contest that you like, and make a lineup with your $100 salary. And later this week, be sure to check out my XFL DFS primer that I'll be posting on Numberfire. But for more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions may apply. According to DynastyLeagueFootball.com's January startup average draft position data, that's a mouthful, but according to that data, Aaron Rodgers is the QB9, and he's the QB9 sort of in his own tier. He's well below Josh Allen, but he's well above Baker Mayfield. Maybe this wouldn't be the case in your league. Maybe people are viewing Rodgers a lot lower than this, but I can only roll with the information that I've got. And what I've got is that people still view Rodgers as a solid enough QB1 in Dynasty. This is despite the fact that he's 36th, despite the fact that he hasn't finished higher than that QB9 mark in a single season since 2016, and despite the fact that Rodgers' yards per attempt rate hasn't been higher than 7.4, which would have ranked 16th among qualified quarterbacks in 2019. He hasn't had a yards per attempt rate higher than 7.4 since 2014. I see no reason to have Rodgers ahead of Baker Mayfield, not even for a contender. I talked about Mayfield on last week's buy candidates episode, so you can get that information on him there. But are the two players really going to have drastically different outlooks for the 2020 season? And if your answer is no, then why are we favoring the 36-year-old quarterback in Dynasty right now? At Aaron Rodgers' peak, he was arguably the best quarterback that we've ever seen. But he hasn't been that for a long time, and it's shown in fantasy football. The only way that you can justify ranking him this high is if the Packers do something substantial at wide receiver over the offseason. And maybe that happens. And don't get me wrong, Rodgers probably still has the ability to give you a high-end QB1 ceiling, to give you one of those seasons. From a probability perspective, though, we've only seen his career numbers go in the wrong direction as he's gotten older. That's not what you want from an aged quarterback in Dynasty. If someone's still valuing him as the QB9, it's time to sell. Rodgers is actually the only quarterback sell that I have on today's show. ADP in general looks pretty good at the position, and his spot was just so glaring that I had to talk about him. So let's move on to running backs, and let's go to one of the more controversial players in all of fantasy football, and that's Derrick Henry. I took the L with Derrick Henry earlier last month on the Things That I Missed podcast. But like I said on that show, the process for not being super into Henry wasn't that far off in my opinion. Let me run back some of the stats from that show to explain why. Without Ryan Tannehill last year, Derrick Henry averaged 69 yards, nice, and 14.6 PPR points per game. When Tannehill took over as quarterback, that yards per game number jumped by 56, and his points per game average rose by well over 8. When Marcus Mariota was under center, Derrick Henry wasn't that great of a fantasy back. When Ryan Tannehill, who was arguably the league's most efficient passer this year, depending on the metric that you look at, when he took over, things changed for Derrick Henry. At least a portion of this can be credited to game script. Henry's snap rate jumped by about 10% when Ryan Tannehill took over, because Tennessee went from ranking 12th in the NFL in offensive plays run while trailing by 7 or more under Marcus Mariota to running the 10th fewest when Tannehill was playing. They were leading more. For a running back that's not used very heavily in the passing game, that's a big deal. Henry hit his career high in targets this past year. That's great. But he also only had 24 targets. That's not great. And don't forget, the Titans were a complete outlier with their red zone efficiency this past season. I sent a tweet prior to the AFC Championship game that showed red zone touchdown to field goal ratio from week 7 onward. That week 7 mark was when Ryan Tannehill took over. During that time and up until that championship game, the Titans had scored 31 red zone touchdowns while kicking 1 red zone field goal. To give you some perspective of how insane that is, the team that was second highest in ratio over that time was Carolina. They had 17 touchdowns versus 4 field goals. The Titans had a ratio of 30 freaking 1-1 in terms of red zone touchdown to field goals. The Panthers had a ratio of 4.3, and they were in second. There's almost zero chance that the Titans are going to be as efficient at scoring touchdowns next season as they were this year. Now, in general, when I'm looking to sell players in Dynasty, I'm asking myself if the guys that I might be looking to sell are currently at peak value. And I think that there's a very easy case to be made that Derrick Henry's value won't be any higher than it is right now, especially with the way that the playoffs went. Because the reality of this situation is that it's going to regress. Let's just look at Derrick Henry himself. He averaged over 5 yards per carry this past year, which was even better than his 4.9 average the year prior. Yards per carry can be a very noisy statistic that isn't very predictive whatsoever. And with any statistic like that, you need to watch out for regression. For example, since 2011, we've seen 48 running back seasons where the running back has had 100 or more carries and a yards per carry rate at or above 5 yards. That's a little over 5 instances per season. In 2019, we had 7 of those seasons, with Henry being one of them. Now, since we had 7 of them in 2019, that means that we've got next season data on 41 of those running backs. So to recap here, 41 running backs since 2011 with 100 or more carries and a yards per carry rate at or above 5. Among those players, only 5 of them were able to maintain that yards per carry rate of 5 the following season. And the next season average was 4.3. But okay, yards per carry matters, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. We're looking for volume. And that's another slight concern with Derrick Henry. He carried the ball 303 times in the regular season this past year. Let's just go through a similar exercise that we just went through. Since 2011, we have 35 instances where a running back has carried the ball 280 or more times in a single season. That 280 number is arbitrary, but it's also a good bit less than where Henry was at in 2019. 30 of those players have next season data. And of those 30 players, only one guy, Marshawn Lynch from 2011 to 2012, only one player was able to increase his attempt numbers the following year. There are probably lots of reasons for this. Players get hurt. Teams aren't as good. Because honestly, in order to see that much volume at running back, your team can't be trailing all the time. But whatever the reason is, we know that seeing a ton of volume year over year isn't an easy thing for a running back to achieve, just naturally. And that's the worry. I'll probably have Derrick Henry ranked as an RB1 next year. I may end up thinking that he's overvalued as ADP in redraft, but this isn't me saying that Henry won't be a usable fantasy asset. It's me looking at the dynasty average draft position data of a 26-year-old running back who had a really good situation in 2019 and stepping back and saying, this from an odds angle isn't likely going to be repeated. And since you can get a lot for Henry right now, it's not a bad idea to shop him, especially if you've got him, but your team isn't in win now mode. I alluded to this next sell candidate in last week's mailbag show, but I think it's time to sell Kerryon Johnson. I'm a believer that Johnson is a good player. I'm a believer that Derrick Henry is too. But with Johnson, my concern isn't the same as Derrick Henry's. With Henry, I'm mostly worried about regression and just selling high. With Johnson, I'm worried about how his coaches might view him and the type of running back that he is. Johnson came out as a pretty good prospect. My running back prospect model has him as an 89th percentile player among all combine invites and players who were drafted since 2006. Which, by the way, guys, I'll be talking about prospects after this week's show, so if you're into that kind of thing, make sure that you tune in. But Kerryon's now played 2 seasons in the league, and we've seen him get hurt in both of those seasons. I'm not necessarily someone who thinks that injury proneness is this huge thing. I'm sure others will talk it up more than I will. But part of our job in fantasy football is to try and think about how coaches and teams will view a certain player, especially a running back, because volume drives the game. Even if Kerryon Johnson is a really good player, if he's in a committee, then he's overvalued at his current RB14 ADP. And that's my worry, that the Lions are going to either add someone to that backfield or just split things up and not allow Johnson to be an every down workhorse. I mean, we even saw some of that this past season. From weeks 1 through 6, which was before Johnson's big injury this year, he had a pair of games where he was under the 60% running back rush share mark, and he averaged just under a 70% running back rush share. For some context, across the entire 2019 season, 11 different running backs hit that 70% running back rush share. And that's without the benefit of not counting missed time. That's just straight up what their running back rush share was across the entire season. And I think there's some concern over his receiving usage when he was healthy too. His average target share per game was just 8% this past year. That was hit by 29 running backs in 2019. And again, those backs don't have the benefit of only counting games where they were healthy. I'm just saying this quickly to drive home the point that Johnson's usage even last year when he was healthy, it wasn't spectacular. And then after 3 games of pretty decent usage on the ground, when they started to really feature him as a running back, he ended up getting hurt for the second straight year. I think the Lions are a dark horse team to add a good back in this year's draft, but I think they've got a decent shot to at least add a body. Johnson should be fine as an RB2 type fantasy asset, but the fear about Johnson's future workload is very real. Raheem Mostert's valuation is going to be all over the place this offseason. Clearly, since I'm bringing him up right now, I think he's more of a sell than a buy. We don't have a very large sample of running backs who have had their first major sign of production during their 5th NFL season. If you look back over the last decade, the names that popped up when I queried this were basically Raheem Mostert, who's going to be 38 years old in April, Jackie Battle, who ran for almost 100 total yards during his first 4 seasons before hitting 597 in his 5th year, and sort of Dion Lewis. Lewis had some production, but he didn't pop until his 3rd year in New England, which was his age 27 season. That's really it. That's all we've got. So you can look at this in 2 ways. One way is to say that Raheem Mostert's age doesn't really matter, because we don't have a large enough sample of players with his career trajectory to make any sort of claim with conviction. The other way to look at this is to say that there aren't many late career breakouts for a reason. That players who aren't very good just aren't very good, so they don't get opportunity out of nowhere because they're not very good. I think both claims are valid to a degree. I'd side more with claim 2 that Mostert may not be the best player in the world, but at this point, it might not matter that much given how San Francisco might view him. I think what's going overlooked a little bit with Mostert is that even if he is going to be some sort of piece of that San Francisco backfield, we know there's likely going to be some headaches there. There's going to be a cap ceiling of some sort. In 2019, only Detroit and Miami saw their top running back and running back rush share see a lower percentage than San Francisco. To put that another way, the highest running back rush share in the 49ers last year was a tie between Tevin Coleman and Raheem Mostert. They were both at 32%. They both had 137 carries. Only Miami running backs and Detroit running backs had a lower maximum running back rush share than that number. And we know Detroit only did because Kerryon Johnson got hurt. And that trickles into the game-by-game level as well. No 49ers running back had even an 80% running back rush share in a single game last year. That was the second lowest mark in the league, ahead of only Baltimore. So what does that tell us? It tells us what we already know. This is a split backfield. Unless there are injuries, we know the 49ers are likely going to split this backfield up unless they get a running back who's a true workhorse. That limits Raheem Mostert's ceiling. So ask yourself, you know there's already a chance that Mostert, at 28 years old, isn't going to last that long because he broke out so late during his NFL career. But then on top of that, we're not even talking about a high probability of him being a workhorse for the 49ers. In fact, Mostert was barely used as a receiver last year. This is why I can't really comprehend why Damian Williams is listed well below Raheem Mostert in Dynasty League Football's January ADP. He's almost the exact same age, but we've got a sample of Damian Williams as a workhorse for the Chiefs. And while we're expecting Kansas City to add a running back this offseason, what if they enter 2020 with Damian Williams as their lead back? That's a far more probable outlook than it is for Raheem Mostert. Mostert's price is going to fluctuate quite a bit from league to league. But if I had him and I can get a player like Damian Williams for him, I think that's a logical move to make. I've got a couple of surprising wide receivers on the list for today's show. And the first one is arguably the best wideout in all of football, and that's DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins is currently the wide receiver 2 in Dynasty behind Michael Thomas. Meaning, if you get rid of DeAndre Hopkins, you're getting a haul. You're getting a whole lot of assets. And I think trying to shop him makes sense, even though I'm a believer that he's the best pass catcher in the game. You always have to play the market. But Hopkins took a step back in 2019. He had by far his lowest output since 2016 when Brock Osweiler was his quarterback. He averaged about 3 fewer points per game than he had during his previous 2 seasons. And moving forward, while I think he can obviously be better because he's DeAndre Hopkins and he's amazing at the game, I do think that there's a little worry. The main worry being Will Fuller. I mentioned this at times on the show throughout the offseason, but Hopkins has had pretty crazy splits with and without Will Fuller over the last 2 years. He's played 13 regular season games without Fuller during this time, and 18 with him. In games without Will Fuller, Hopkins has averaged 11.2 targets per game and a 35% target share. That's resulted in 20.5 PPR points per game. With a healthy and active Will Fuller, Hopkins' targets per game drops by 2. His target share goes from a little over 35% to 29.7%, and his points per game drops by about 2 as well. This still makes DeAndre Hopkins an elite asset in fantasy football. Please don't take this the wrong way. But there are players out there who came close to what Hopkins did in 2019, and they're way cheaper and they're way younger. DJ Moore is probably the perfect example. Both he and Hopkins played in 15 games during the regular season. And just looking at production only, Moore finished with more receiving yards on 15 fewer targets. He had 4 touchdowns instead of 7, but he was also playing with a backup quarterback for the entire season. I'm not saying you trade Hopkins straight up for Moore, but you can get Hopkins for Moore plus some strong assets. And I think that's not a bad approach when you consider what a healthy Will Fuller, which yes, I understand Will Fuller can't stay healthy, but when you consider what a healthy Will Fuller can do to Hopkins splits, instead of him being this easy number 2 wideout in Dynasty, you have some real concerns. The bottom line here, and the reason I wanted to bring up Hopkins on today's show, is because this is 100% a market-driven move. I don't hate the player at all. I love DeAndre Hopkins. I don't even think he's going to be bad over the next couple of years. But your fantasy football lineup is bigger than just one player. That's why it's not a bad call to see what you can get. A really quick and easy way to see if a veteran player is worthy of his startup draft slot is just look at where he's ranked and then see where he's finished in recent seasons. If his ADP is well ahead of where he's finished, then he's probably a little bit overvalued. You should want to investigate things further with that player. And that's what we're seeing a little bit with Stefon Diggs. I love the player, don't get me wrong. But Diggs has now failed to hit 15 PPR points per game in all but one of his 5 NFL seasons. For reference, 15 PPR points per game would have ranked at about wide receiver 20 this past year. That's really where Stefon Diggs has hovered over his career. And what's kind of strange about Diggs is that he hasn't even had an elite target share throughout his career. He's missed a game or two in every season, but his 2018 was the only one where he exceeded or even came close to a 25% target share. But he's currently being drafted at wide receiver 12, just one spot below A.J. Brown, who's a stud. And it's kind of hard to back that, especially because there aren't signs that Minnesota is going to go back to their 2018 philosophy where they were slinging the ball all over the field, where they ranked 6th in the league in neutral script pass to rush attempt ratio. So you've got a situation with Diggs where he's likely going to be on a more run-heavy team in the immediate future if he ends up sticking around with Minnesota. And on that team, we've seen him not live up to his current ADP very often, his current dynasty ADP. So quite simply, and this is probably the most basic analysis of the show, but I just think he's a little bit overvalued. The depth at wide receiver is pretty crazy right now in fantasy football. That's what I talked about on last month's episode on the death of the elite wide receiver. And all signs point to Stefon Diggs not being in that elite tier. He's an unbelievable wide receiver who I think we all love to watch. I'm just speaking from a production standpoint. So if you know that player won't be hitting that tier, that inherently will make him less valuable. I'm just not sure that he's being valued that way by the market. If you didn't hear episode 343 last month on bailing on unproductive rookies, then this next player that you're going to hear is going to sound more shocking than any of you who did listen to it. But I think right now is the time to sell N'Keal Harry. Yes, I liked Harry last year a lot. His production profile was there, especially when you adjust for age. He had the right size, and he had the draft capital to back it all up. And then he got hurt, and then he didn't produce. And I think it's really, really important as a fantasy manager to not make excuses for a player. Yes, N'Keal Harry was hurt, and as I mentioned on the Unproductive Rookies episode, that at least gives us some hope. But the chance that he hits, if we solely look at rookie production, is fairly low at this point. Already, it's pretty low. Among top 20 wide receivers since 2011, about 19% of them had rookie season production that was as bad as N'Keal Harry's. A 1 in 5 chance of hitting is not the best. And the main reason I'm bringing him up is because of where he's currently being drafted. If he was being valued as like a wide receiver 4 or something, then I would be all for holding tight. I may even buy N'Keal Harry if that was his price. But he's not. He's being selected one wide receiver pick below Terry McLaurin. And he's being drafted ahead of Robert Woods and Jarvis Landry. I played Dynasty by looking at a 3-year window with more weight being put on those first 2 seasons. And from a probability standpoint, there seems to be a much higher chance that Robert Woods and Jarvis Landry outproduce N'Keal Harry than N'Keal Harry outproducing them. But of course, Harry has the ceiling. But that ceiling is strictly there because of ambiguity. But what exactly is that ceiling? What's a reasonable ceiling for N'Keal Harry? The truly elite wide receivers in fantasy football right now weren't as unproductive as he was during their rookie year. The only player who was Antonio Brown. So Harry's chance to be elite really is not that high. That's why I'm selling him right now. Because if he has a bad sophomore season, he's going to be worthless as a dynasty asset. I hope that doesn't happen, but I'd rather get a really solid contributor now without having to risk it. The last player I want to touch on today is Zach Ertz. Ertz was another guy that I brought up quite a bit on the podcast during last offseason. It had everything to do with how he's performed when the Eagles have had competition at pass catcher. In 2018, when the Eagles added Golden Tate, we watched Zach Ertz's target share fall by 3.5%. In 2019, this past year, we saw a similar split with Alshon Jeffrey. Ertz's target share without Jeffrey was almost 26% per game. When Alshon Jeffrey was in the lineup, that number fell to 22%. And by the way, when Deshaun Jackson also played in Week 1, Ertz was below an 18% target share. It does seem like his 2018 season, the only one where he exceeded 14.5 fantasy points per game, it seems like that was an outlier. That's where he scored 17.5 points per game, where the Eagles were a top 10 team in pass to rush attempt ratio, and where his target share was over 4 percentage points higher than any other season of his career. Ertz is going to be 30 years old in November. He plays a position that's pretty replaceable in fantasy football given that you're only starting one of those players at the position. And the Eagles are likely going to continue to add at pass catcher. And Dallas Goedert started to come on during the second half of last season. Again, Ertz is a fine player. This has everything to do with the market. If you can get a solid return on him now, it's worth it. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later this week with the Weekly Mailbag Show.